The air inside the obsidian chamber was heavier than gravity itself. Not a single being spoke. Not a single being moved. Across the room, 13 of the deadliest assassins in the galaxy sat in a perfect semicircle, their luminous eyes locked on the figure before them. A human. No armor, no weapons, no cybernetic enhancements, just a man in a worn-out jacket, hands tucked casually in his pockets, his stance relaxed, as if he had just wandered into the deadliest room in the universe by accident, a Krelvas executioner, its exoskeletal, fingers twitching on the hilt of a plasma dagger, let out a low, clicking growl. This must be a joke. No one laughed. The assassins of the Silent Veil were a myth, whispered of in the shadowed corners of intergalactic syndicates, their contracts paid in the blood of civilizations. Every government, every warlord, every empire in the cosmos feared their unseen blades, and yet in all their eons of existence they had never seen anything like this. The human exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You know," he mused, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I expected a warmer welcome. Maybe a drink, a seat at the table." His gaze flicked to the throne at the center of the chamber, the chair that belonged to the leader of the Silent Veil. It was empty. A deep, guttural voice rumbled from the darkness. "The High Executor is dead." A cold amusement played at the corner of the human's mouth. "I know." Something unseen shifted in the air. Muscles tensed. Claws flexed. Weapons, still holstered, were no longer at rest. The Krelvas snarled. "Then you know what that means." The human tilted his head. "Oh, I know exactly what it means." His boots echoed as he took a single step forward. Then another, and another. The assassins did not move, but every fiber of their being was coiled, ready to strike. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the human stopped, and he smiled. "I'm here to take his place." The silence stretched. The assembled assassins didn't react, but their stillness was a deception. Each of them was calculating, assessing, waiting for the first move, waiting to see if this human was an anomaly to be dissected or a fool to be erased. The Krelvas executioner was the first to break. With a sudden, fluid motion, it drew its plasma dagger and took a step forward, mandibles flaring in fury. "No outsider sits on that throne." The human barely glanced at him. "It's empty, isn't it?" His voice was unhurried, controlled. "Someone's got to fill it." The Krelvas lunged. It was fast, not merely fast, inhumanly so, a blur of muscle and exoskeletal armor, the plasma blade screaming through the air. Any ordinary being wouldn't have even seen it coming. The human moved not back, not away. Forward. The moment the Krelvas struck, he was already inside its guard, slipping past the dagger's arc like it was a sluggish thing. A flick of his wrist, a shift in weight, and the assassin's own momentum became a weapon against him. The impact was subtle, but decisive. The Krelvas was suddenly on the ground, gasping for air. His weapon clattering away, a stunned silence followed. The other assassins barely moved, but the energy in the room had changed. They had just witnessed something that shouldn't have happened. A human, unaugmented, unarmed, had dismantled a Silent Veil executioner in less than 2 seconds. The human exhaled slowly, then crouched beside the gasping Krelvas, his voice low. "If you're going to draw a blade," he murmured, "you'd better know what you're swinging at." He rose again, his movements precise, controlled. He had given them a demonstration, not a massacre. The throne room remained deathly still. Then from the shadows, a voice, deep, guttural, amused. Well, maybe you're not as stupid as you look." A new figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the light. She was unlike the others, tall, draped in sleek, segmented armor that pulsed faintly with energy. A Zenvari huntress, her obsidian skin traced with shifting crimson bioluminescence. She walked with the careful poise of a predator, every step deliberate, every motion a whisper of restrained violence. Her piercing, slit-pupil eyes locked. "Onto the human. You've come to take the high executive seat," she said smoothly. "You've made your entrance." A small smile played at the edges of her lips. "But tell me, human, do you have what it takes to stay in it?" The human met her gaze without hesitation. "That depends," he said. "Are you here to welcome me or test me?" The Zenvari huntress tilted her head, amused. "Oh, we don't test, we eliminate." The chamber darkened as hidden mechanisms in the walls whirred to life. The room shifted, the throne receding into the floor. The air grew charged, as if the very structure of the room had transformed into something else. Something alive. A trial. Proving ground. The Silent Veil did not accept leaders. They killed them, and the human had just entered the den. The chamber shifted. Walls groaned and split apart like the unfurling ribs of a beast, revealing a new arena, vast and circular, illuminated by eerie crimson glyphs. The throne, once the centerpiece, was gone, swallowed by the floor. In its place, a deep pit opened beneath the human's feet, not a natural pit, a calculated one, a killing ground. The human adjusted his stance, his hands still tucked into his jacket pockets. He wasn't surprised. He had expected this. The Zenvari huntress remained standing at the chamber's edge, her gaze filled with quiet amusement. "You wanted the throne?" she mused. "First, you survived the inheritance." From the shadows, something moved. No, not something. Many things. The walls, now laced with jagged slits, released 12 shapes, each stepping forward in perfect synchronization. Silent Veil eliminators. The finest killers in the galaxy, stripped of individuality, trained from infancy in the art of slaughter. Their bodies were sleek, enhanced with cybernetic augmentations. Their movements were eerily smooth, unnatural in their precision. Some wielded blade-formed gauntlets, others energy-based weaponry, designed for close-quarters combat. They did not speak. They did not hesitate. They attacked. The first one came from the right, too fast for any ordinary being to react. A black blur, slicing low, aiming to sever tendons and cripple the human before he could fight back. But the human wasn't ordinary. His head tilted slightly, a whisper of emotion, almost imperceptible. The assassin's blade whistled past his throat, missing by a fraction of a centimeter. The human exhaled. Then he moved. A sidestep, a twist, and his leg lashed out, connecting with the assassin's wrist. The blade shot from its grip, spinning into the air, and in the same fluid motion, the human snatched it, turning it against its owner. One strike. Clean. The assassin collapsed, throat slit. The remaining 11 did not pause. They adapted. 2. From behind, another from the side. One feint, 2 real strikes, a dozen possibilities. The human moved through them like a ghost, slipping through war. Every attack was avoided by a breath. Every counter was merciless. A disarmed enemy became an opportunity. A mistimed strike became a fatal mistake. Another assassin fell, then another. The Zenvari huntress watched from the edge of the arena, her expression unreadable. She had expected the human to put up a fight. She had expected resistance. But not this. This was slaughter. The eliminators were fast. The human was faster. The eliminators were efficient. The human was instinct itself. One by one, the bodies hit the floor, the crimson glyphs beneath them absorbing the spilled blood, pulsing brighter with each kill. By the time the last assassin fell, the chamber was silent again. The human, breathing steadily, tossed the stolen blade aside. It clattered against the ground, ringing in the stillness. He turned to face the huntress. His voice was calm. Controlled. So. His hands slid back into his pockets. "Do I get the chair now, or do I have to fight the furniture too?" A single Laugh escaped her lips, low, amused, impressed. The others in the room, once watching with detachment, now regarded the human with something different, something more dangerous. They weren't laughing, they were re-evaluating. The silence held. Not the silence of uncertainty, but of calculation. The assassins who remained standing, the true veterans of the Silent Veil, had expected a corpse to be dragged from this chamber, not a human still standing. Yet here he was. The Zenvari huntress studied him with quiet interest. The amusement in her gaze had settled into something far sharper. He wasn't just a skilled warrior, he was something else, something they hadn't accounted for. "Impressive," she admitted at last. "You move like someone who's been in the dark a long time." The human tilted his head slightly. "Maybe I just got tired of the light." A slow smirk played across her lips. "We'll see." A sharp clap echoed through the chamber. The true players stepped forward. From the deeper recesses of the chamber, 3 figures emerged, silent, deliberate, each exuding a presence that was entirely different from the eliminators the human had just cut through. These weren't pawns, they were executioners, the real challengers. The first was a Vorak war priest, his forearms crossed over a chest plated, with ritualistic armor, each limb gripping a different weapon, an electro-stave, a monofilament garrote, a blade-thin scattergun, and a hook designed for tearing bones from flesh. His golden eyes regarded the human with nothing but professional curiosity. The second was a Hrysian phantasm, her body shifting with a cloak of refractive light. A specialist in stealth and deception, the kind of killer whose existence was only ever known by their victims in their final moments. The third was a Gorval behemoth, twice the size of the human, his scaled hide laced with dermal armor implants, his cybernetic forearms reinforced to strike with the force of a railgun. Together, they had carved 1,000 deaths across the stars. Tonight, they would test if the human was worthy of joining them, or if he was just another body to be disposed of. The Zenvari huntress folded her arms, her glowing eyes watching every movement. "You survived the first wave," she mused, "but that was the test for the rank and file." The Vorak priest uncrossed one of his arms, spinning the electro-stave between his fingers with an unsettling ease. "We are not rank and file." The human exhaled slowly, flexing his fingers before rolling his shoulders. "No weapons, no augmentations, just him." "All right," he said, a small smirk tugging at his lips. "Let's see if you hit harder than your last guys." The behemoth struck first. A single step closed the distance between them, and his fist blurred through the air like a meteor, the impact alone sending a shockwave through the chamber. But it didn't hit. The human was already underneath the strike, moving before the impact could land, pivoting on instinct. The behemoth's fist obliterated the stone pillar behind him instead, sending shards of debris raining across the arena. Then the real fight began. The Vorak priest's electro-stave crackled, arcing toward the human's spine. The human twisted, mid-air, catching the edge of a falling stone slab and flipping onto it just before the charged impact slammed into the ground, scorching the floor where he had stood a fraction of a second earlier. Before he could land, the phantasm disappeared. She wasn't attacking, not yet. She was waiting, watching for the moment he committed to an action. He didn't give her one. Instead, he shifted his trajectory mid-motion, feinting toward the behemoth before angling straight for the Vorak priest, his feet hitting the ground at an impossible angle. The priest was ready, or so he thought. The moment his electro-stave lashed forward, the human wasn't there anymore. He redirected his momentum, slipping past the strike at the last moment. The Vorak's stance wavered, a mistake. In a blur, the human's hand shot up, catching the priest's wrist. Then he pivoted, hard. The Vorak's own weight was used against him. The electro-stave ripped from his grasp, twisted in a fraction of a second, and driven straight into the behemoth's ribs. The charged impact sent a shockwave through the chamber. The Gorval staggered. The phantasm moved. A blade materialized. At the human's throat. For a second, a hairline moment, it seemed too late. Then, a pulse in the air. The phantasm's wrist jerked mid-strike, her cloak shorting out as the chamber's ambient energy interfered with her light-bending tech. Oh, millisecond miscalculation. A millisecond was all the human needed. He shifted. The blade grazed past him instead of through him. Then he struck, a sharp elbow to the solar plexus, a twist, a disarm. The phantasm blinked once before she realized she was on the floor, her blade in the human's grip. The behemoth growled, rising. Again! The Vorak priest coughed, his systems overloaded. The phantasm clutched her ribs, her body flickering in and out of visibility. The human tossed the stolen blade aside, unfazed. Then he looked back at the Zenvari huntress. She hadn't moved, but now she was smiling. For the first time, the amusement had faded into something else, something closer to respect. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a test to see if the human would survive. It was a test to see what he was capable of. The Vorak priest spat blood onto the floor. The behemoth steadied himself, cybernetic forearms whirring as his dermal implants recalibrated. The phantasm, though wounded, flickered back into semi-invisibility, shifting like a mirage. None of them had expected this. This was no fluke. The human wasn't surviving the Silent Veil's gauntlet. He was winning. The Zenvari huntress had not moved from her perch at the edge of the chamber, but now her gaze held something deeper. Calculation. She had seen thousands of deaths. She had orchestrated hundreds herself, and yet in this moment she saw something different. A single thought crossed her mind. Did we just make a mistake? The behemoth lunged again, his speed impossible for something of his size. The chamber trembled. With each step, his sheer mass alone making escape seem impossible. The human didn't run. Instead, he met the charge head-on, a last-second shift, an almost imperceptible angle change, and the behemoth's own momentum became his downfall. Tasaisul. Human twisted his body in a single, perfectly timed pivot. The behemoth's strike grazed past him, missing by less than an inch. But what mattered was the follow-through. The human moved in the same breath, slipping beneath the behemoth's swing and driving his knee into a single, unarmored pressure. Point at the base of the creature's spine. A snap, the behemoth collapsed, not dead. Not even mortally wounded, but paralyzed. The chamber was deathly silent. The Vorak priest and the phantasm froze. They had fought wars, they had hunted warlords, but they had never seen someone shut down a Gorval behemoth like that. The phantasm made her choice. She vanished. Cowardice? No. Survival. The Vorak priest, ever the pragmatist, let out a slow breath and dropped his weapon. Enough. The human met his gaze. You yield. The Vorak gave a slow nod. I recognize the difference between skill and inevitability. His golden eyes flicked toward the Zenvari huntress, and so should they. The chamber was still. Then, a slow, deliberate clap. The Zenvari huntress descended from her perch, stepping onto the blood-stained arena floor. Her presence alone shifted the air. The remaining assassins stiffened, but did not speak. The huntress stopped a few feet from the human and smiled, a sharp, amused, deadly thing. You fought well. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. You proved something tonight. The human arched a brow. That I'm fast? No. Her slit-pupilled gaze gleamed. That you understand the only rule that matters. A pause. She stepped aside, revealing the throne. It had risen from the ground once more, black and unyielding, a relic of obsidian and alien steel, its edges laced with the faintest glow of ancient energy. The High Executor's seat. The human looked at it, then back at her. The Zenvari huntress tilted her head. A throne in a kingdom of killers is not given. She gestured to the silent, waiting assassins. It's taken. A beat. The human exhaled, rolling his shoulders, then took a step forward. Then another. Not a single assassin moved to stop him. They watched, evaluating, judging, accepting. The human ascended the steps, slowly, deliberately. Then, with the same ease that he had entered the chamber, he lowered himself onto the throne. It fit him perfectly. A quiet hum of energy passed through the chamber. A recognition, the assassins of the Silent Veil. Warriors. Of 1,000 worlds, executioners feared across the stars, stood in silence, and then, one by one, they knelt. The human leaned back into the seat, exhaling. Well, he murmured, that was fun. The Zenvari huntress grinned. Then, with a slow, deliberate bow of her head, she knelt too. The weight of the moment settled like a shifting tide. The Silent Veil, a name spoken in hushed whispers across the void, had just acknowledged something. Unprecedented, a human now sat in the high executor's seat. The kneeling assassins remained motionless, their faces masked, unreadable. This was no ceremony, no declaration of loyalty. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The strong sit, the weak kneel, and at this moment the human was the strongest in the room. The Zenvari huntress rose first. Her glowing eyes studied him, her expression carrying something between amusement and calculation. You've won the seat, she murmured. But do you know what you've really taken? The human exhaled, gaze sweeping across the chamber. Power? The huntress chuckled. Power is an illusion. You've taken something far more dangerous. A beat. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. Responsibility. A murmur ran through the assembled assassins. Not disagreement, not defiance, but something close to recognition. The Silent Veil had never had a leader in the way governments or syndicates did. Their hierarchy was simple. The one at the top remained there until they weren't. By wit, by blade, by deception, or brute force. The throne had always changed hands in blood, and yet, in all their long, shadowed history, they had never had a leader like this. A human. An outsider who had strolled into their world with nothing but his wits, his hands, and a smirk that had mocked their very existence. The huntress studied him. Every high executor before you had a plan, a vision, a purpose. She tilted her head. What's yours? The human let the question sit in the air. Then he smiled and leaned forward in the throne, I think, he mused. It's time we started aiming higher. The room shifted. The huntress's eyes narrowed in curiosity. Higher? The human drummed his fingers against the armrest, gaze flicking toward the assassins, those who had tried to kill him, those who had knelt before him. You're all killers, he said. The best, the kind that makes warlords piss themselves and empires rethink their security budgets. He tilted his head slightly. But tell me, when was the last time you actually changed anything? A murmur ran through the room. You're ghosts, shadows. You move unseen, do your jobs and vanish. But what's the point of power if you're always using it for someone else? The assassins listened, and for the first time, they considered. The Silent Veil had never been anything more than a weapon for hire. Their blades had shaped conflicts, ended dynasties, silenced rulers before their voices could change the stars, but never on their own terms, never for themselves. The human's fingers tapped once more against the armrest. I think it's time we stopped being a hired gun. The huntress smiled. The room changed, not in movement, not in sound, but in intent. Something fundamental had shifted in the air. The assassins of the Silent Veil did not follow. They did not obey, but they did respect power. And for the first time, they saw a future that was not dictated by others, a future where they were the ones calling the shots. The huntress took a slow breath. Interesting. She turned toward the assembled assassins. "Looks like our High Executor has ambition." A ripple of unspoken acknowledgement passed through them. Not acceptance, not loyalty, but potential. And in the world of shadows, potential was everything. The human leaned back in his throne, his smirk returning. "Now," he said, "let's talk business." The Silent Veil had never sworn allegiance to anyone. They were ghosts, executioners without masters, silent, precise, and untouchable. And yet, here they were, not kneeling, not obeying, but listening. Shift had begun, not in words, but in the space between them, a fundamental unspoken change in the nature of the veil itself. The human leaned back in the High Executor's seat, fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. He had fought, survived, and taken the throne, but a throne was just a chair unless the people around it were willing to move. The Zenvari huntress stood at his side, her slit-pupilled eyes watching him with something more dangerous than admiration: curiosity. "You've done the impossible," she murmured, voice low. "But tell me, what happens when the rest of the galaxy finds out?" A smirk pulled at the human's lips. "Then they'll do what they always do." She arched a brow. "Which is?" He exhaled, stretching slightly, as if the weight of the throne was nothing more than an afterthought. "They'll panic." A beat, then movement, a distant sound, communication lines flickering to life as hidden figures in the room began to act. The Silent Veil was not a single entity. It was a network of operatives, assassins, and spies embedded in the darkest corners of the galaxy. And now, that network was changing hands. One by one, transmissions whispered through encrypted channels. Warlords, syndicates, planetary governments, all of them would soon hear the same thing, that something unthinkable had happened, that the Silent Veil had a new leader, and that leader was not an alien, not a warlord, not a machine, a human. The ramifications were already unfolding. Some factions would scramble to understand, some would laugh, disbelieving. Some would send their own assassins, thinking it was a mistake that could still be corrected, and some, the smart ones, would realize the truth before the first blood was spilled, that this wasn't a coup. It was an evolution. The huntress tilted her head slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. "They won't let this stand," she murmured. The human grinned. "Good." The moment stretched, and then, for the first time in the history of the Silent Veil, laughter echoed through the chamber. Not cruel, not mocking, just amused. A quiet, knowing chuckle that rippled through the assassins like a spreading crack in the foundation of the old order. It wasn't the laughter of a man who had won. It was the laughter of a man who was just getting started. The Silent Veil had always been feared, but now the galaxy had something new to be afraid of.